Annie graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2018. She received her master's degree in social policy and development with a focus on NGOs. Prior to studying there, she earned her BA in Anthropology and International Development from UCLA. In 2016-17, she spent a year living in Armenia, interning in two women's rights NGOs. The first, the Women's Resource Center Armenia, and the second, Society Without Violence. Since graduating from LSE, Annie has returned to Armenia as an international fellow at the Caucasus Research Resource Center. Her research interests include gender and development, civil society-state relationship, and social movements. And the topic that she will discuss today is spontaneous and unorganized, reconceptualizing formal and informal activism in the Armenian women's movement.
Before I get started, I just wanted to thank the ARPA Institute for inviting me here today and giving me a platform to share my work. Okay, so for my master's thesis, I set out to explore the ways in which dominant Western-centric social movement theories were unable to fully explain the realities of movements within post-Soviet settings. In particular, I was frustrated by the dichotomous, almost linear relationship movement theorists presented between formal and informal activism. There seemed to be an expectation for movements to go through a cycle of mass mobilization and eventually institutionalize. This transition into formal institutions was presented as the end of a movement's life cycle and said to be the point where the movement wins contentious challenges and are best positioned to succeed. However, this framework didn't fit the reality experienced in Armenia. This is because what we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that institutionalized forms of activism, overwhelmingly in the form of non-governmental organizations or NGOs, emerged within...
Hold it closer to your mouth.
I think the batteries.
I think the batteries are dying, yeah.
It's okay, I'll just talk loud.
No.
I think it might, it's back, it might go out in a little bit, but just keep going. This is because what we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that institutionalized forms of activism, overwhelmingly in the form of non-governmental organizations or NGOs, emerged within the formal political sphere to address social issues, while more informal initiatives have only just emerged in the last decade, but present a new opportunity to exert agency and influence change from the margins of formal institutions. To explain this divergence, I studied the dynamics within the Armenian women's movement in order to understand formal and informal avenues used by women in Armenia to achieve gender equality and social change that may not necessarily fit the movement paradigm I explained before. As such, a bulk of my time today will be spent presenting the major themes that emerged from semi-structured, in-depth interviews I conducted with the movement's main actors between March 28th and April 12th, 2018. So right before the revolution, a fact I hope that you will keep in mind through the rest of my talk. I will argue that alternative forms of contention underscore the tactics used by women's movement actors. Furthermore, I will contend that context-specific challenges have blurred the boundaries between formal and informal activism, ultimately leading to innovation and approaches used by women in Armenia to achieve change. I will conclude by briefly discussing the implications of revolution and democratization on women's activism moving forward and the questions they pose. The Armenian women's movement is characterized by women's NGOs in the formal sphere and informal or grassroots feminist initiatives on the periphery. I chose to focus on this particular movement as my case study because the origins, organizational structures, and tactics of the movement's actors present an opportunity to explore both formal and informal activism within one movement landscape, and more closely examine how they mobilize and why they choose to use the tactics they do. Additionally, while the existence of NGOs in Armenia has been widely examined, grassroots activism remains understudied. On one hand, women's NGOs emerge and mobilize within the formal political sphere. The rapid increase of NGOs addressing women's issues in the 1990s was a result of Western-led democracy-building programs, which was referred to as the genetic engineering of Armenian civil society. Human rights-oriented NGOs received the bulk of international funding early on. Women's rights NGOs addressing women's empowerment and domestic violence included. These issues remain the primary concern of women's NGOs today. Additionally, because of donor dependency and structural constraints, solutions pursued by NGOs are often policy or service-oriented. This includes advocating for an anti-domestic violence law, running shelters, hotlines, and police sensitivity trainings, just to name a few. Although the transformative potential of NGOs, formal activism has been questioned, their relative achievement, particularly in the policy sphere, is significant and should be acknowledged. On the other hand, the rise in informal feminist activism in the country coincided with the growth of grassroots movements or civic initiatives, which took place in the last decade. Some civic initiatives include Mashtut's Park Movement, Harudaram, Save Tevut, and even more recently, the Merji Serji Movement and Save Amosat. Feminist initiatives loosely mirror the non-hierarchical organizational structure of civic initiatives. They are volunteer-based and use consensus decision-making. Informal feminist activism in Armenia manifests in small groups, typically between 2 to 10 people, engages in a diverse range of feminist political thought. It is not homogeneous within itself, which then plays a role in determining the initiative's issues and tactics. For example, radical or anarchist feminists may take on a broad issue of imperialism or militarism, and their tactics may range from occupying public spaces to graffiti. Marxist feminists might work to address issues of economic and labor justice by running communes and publishing relevant texts. And for queer feminists seeking to subvert the heteronormativity of everyday public life, art and theater become a medium for activism. What is particularly interesting in the case of the women's movement in Armenia is the shared concern among the women I spoke to that using a narrow conceptualization of movement, like the one put forth by dominant social movement theorists, runs the risk of overlooking more non-traditional efforts for mobilization that women in Armenia are engaging in. So while mass mobilization may not be a viable option for women's movement actors in Armenia, recognizing the formal and informal avenues women in Armenia use to mobilize is an important step in recognizing that context shapes what direction movements assume, and that activists have the agency to employ different repertoires to achieve change. As Kanar puts it, a movement isn't only about numbers. We may be small, but we exist, and that existence in itself is an important component for change. Just a side note, all of the names of my participants have been changed just to protect their anonymity. So alternative types of mobilization characterize the Armenian women's movement landscape. How might we explain why the actors choose to mobilize differently? The reality demonstrates that non-traditional forms of contention underline alternative forms of mobilization that are present in the movement. Women's NGOs engage in consentful contention, while feminist activists engage in contentious contention. A bit of a mouthful there. Organizations that engage in consentful contention pursue changes that are defined within the frames of existing power structures, with limited challenges to the state or political regime. Let's consider the issue of domestic violence, which has been central to women's NGOs. NGO mobilization around the issue has been consentful in nature, as success has predominantly been framed as changes within the political sphere. Narina states, "We recognize that we need to target societal thinking, but we need governmental change too." So when in December 2017, women's NGOs in Armenia reached a milestone with the passage of a law by the country's National Assembly criminalizing violence in the family, which itself is derivative of an anti-domestic violence bill presented by a coalition of women's NGOs. NGO representatives were clear in stating that working within the system was a critical approach for achieving comprehensive domestic violence solution, even if it is gradual. And ultimately, this was celebrated as a victory. As Gohar states, this is a victory because now we have a preventative mechanism in place. We don't know how it works exactly, but it's there, and that's progress. Progress here is measured within the boundaries of formal politics. For women's NGOs, having a formal tool to maneuver political structures is part of the rational progression for NGOs in pursuit of greater gender equality. Additionally, this establishes clear institutional definition for their issues and thus helps identify relevant policy solutions which they are then able to rally around. Ultimately, by engaging in consentful contention, women's NGOs sidestep mass mobilization and attempt to create change while also maintaining their position within the formal political sphere. In contrast to the NGO's consentful engagement with domestic violence, independent feminists described the law as mournful and criticized it for problematically drawing boundaries around women's issues without challenging systemic inequalities at its root. Thus, informal feminist activism is understood by contentious contention in an attempt to balance uneven power relations within the public sphere. Unlike women's rights organizations, informal feminist activists make deliberate attempts to remain informal and on the periphery of institutions. Thus, the activism they engage in is overtly contentious and addressed using spontaneous and unorganized tactics. Furthermore, ideological and political motivations underscore informal feminist activism, an aspect not as obvious in NGO work. For feminist activists, spontaneous and unorganized actions emerge from their individual realities as a marginalized group and attempt to politicize their experiences and be disruptive. Feminist criticism of NGOs and their tactics is not only linked to their dissatisfaction with NGO tactics and liberal discourses, but it is linked to their wider criticism of structural inequality, which they see as integral to their feminist activism. As Thought states, the freedom and ability to express myself as a feminist is linked to the criticism of NGOs and criticism of the neoliberal system they represent. So when asked what contentious solutions to domestic violence would look like, the most common answer is cultural revolution, which comes from the grassroots, not the international organizations, the state, or NGOs. Ultimately, women's NGOs engage in consentful contention because they emerge within the formal political sphere rather than seeking to transition into institutionalized form. They work to maintain their formal status. On the other hand, rather than seeking inclusion within formal politics, grassroots feminist contentious repertoires are spontaneous and unorganized, with the intention to remain informal and peripheral. And although they are different, both groups deviate from the dominant social movement trajectories. Perhaps the most common and reoccurring theme to emerge from my interviews was the fact that no movement actor was completely detached from the other. While the divergence in activism between the two groups discussed previously presents the impression that women's NGOs and feminist activists are in opposition, the reality is that boundaries between the groups are constantly distorted as women's movement actors engage in surreptitious symbiosis, a phenomenon coined and more closely examined by Iglesias and Ishkanyan in relation to the other civic initiatives I named earlier. This interdependence between the two groups begins to break down the dichotomous understanding of formalized and informal actors within the movement. On the most fundamental level, NGOs play an important role as intermediaries between feminism and young women in Armenia. Even those who today are highly critical of NGOs recognize the important role NGOs played in the formation of their feminist consciousness and entry into more contentious activism. Datev, whose quote we see right here, cites her introduction to feminism as a My Body, My Rights training she attended at an NGO. She later worked at the same NGO before leaving to pursue independent activism. Moving beyond construction of feminist consciousness, there is an indisputable interdependence between NGOs and independent feminists in terms of resources and reliance within the movement landscape that further complicates the binary between formal and informal. The first significant effect of this relationship is that NGOs provide support to grassroots feminist initiatives, which then allows independent activists to have greater access to resources without compromising their informality. Commenting on this relationship, Kanar said, NGOs are its resource. You just have to know how to use them. Using the example of her own personal grassroots initiative and anti-militarism street art action, Kanar continued to describe the dynamic. I applied to X NGO's grant to do my project. In the end, it isn't an NGO project. It was my idea that came from me and reflects local issues and local concerns. It's grassroots. The NGO just gave me the resources to do it. The image in the back over here, I don't know if it's clear enough to be seen, is actually part of Kanar's initiative, and it is an image of a Armenian woman in traditional dress breaking a rifle over her head, and next to it it says, "Voch Baderazmi biznesin," no to the business of war. Another effect of the surreptitious relationship between the movement actors is that it provides NGOs an opportunity for decoupling. By decoupling, NGOs continue with the projects they are required to do in order to formally meet the needs and criteria of the donors they are accountable to, while also supporting the needs of local grassroots feminist space in the form of organizational space, materials and financial support, and specialized information. While some welcome the NGO's attempt at decoupling, others question if it is really possible, stating that it remains rooted in uneven dynamics, which give NGOs more control and power in grassroots initiatives. Ultimately, the women's movement landscape in Armenia challenges the assumption that formal and informal activism are dichotomous. Not only do informal grassroots initiatives and formalized NGOs exist within the same movement sphere, but the boundaries of the formal and informal are being pushed by movement actors who cooperate, cross over, and challenge traditional organizational lines by engaging in surreptitious symbiosis, leaving us to question how much room there is for spontaneous and unorganized activism. As Ara states, it is problematic to pit NGOs and grassroots organizations against each other because the reality of Armenia doesn't allow for NGOs and grassroots activists to be separate. In presenting my concluding thoughts, it only seems appropriate to reflect on the current condition of Armenian civil society. On April 12, 2018, I completed my final interview for this study while sitting in the heart of Mashnut Park. The very next day, thousands of Armenians took to the streets against former President Serge Sargsyan's stranglehold on the country's political system, effectively marking the beginning of the Armenian Velvet Revolution. Reflecting on the events which took place in April, the research for the study presents a valuable snapshot of Armenian civil society right before movement dynamics were drastically altered. Although the long-term effect of such rapid transformation is unknown, the short-term impact suggests an undoubtable shift in societal perception of public space and renewed faith in transformative potential and mass mobilization. But such changes leave me with several questions about the future of formal and informal women's activism. How has democratization via mass participatory action impacted tactics employed by women's movement actors? Has a renewed faith in the state shifted the dynamics between formal and informal women's activists, especially as some prominent grassroots activists have since institutionalized and are now part of the state? And finally, how does understanding the evolving relationship between civil society and state in a post-revolutionary era help us uncover the ways in which women's movement actors are able to influence the political environment and secure appropriate changes moving forward? Thank you.